Okay, so we have to talk about finance and markets because I think we're being lied to about what's really going on with a massive shift in how the world's money actually moves. We just saw the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, sign a 287-page law on August 4th, effectively legalizing crypto in Russia. Now, the official story is that this is about Russia trying to get around sanctions, right? But the math just doesn't add up. Why would they go to all that trouble, only to cap their own citizens at buying about $3,700 worth of crypto per year? That's not how you bypass global financial systems. If you see something that makes no sense once, it could be a mistake. But it's happened with multiple countries now. That's a pattern. Welcome to the Alpha Brief. I'm Marcus Reid, and if you're new here, we follow the money so you don't have to. Today, we're going to break down how a seemingly minor legal change in Russia is actually a desperate move to build a financial wall against an impending global dollar tsunami, and what that means for your wallet. Now, you might be thinking, what does Russia legalizing crypto have to do with me? Well, everything. If you own a home, changes in the global reserve currency status can send your mortgage rates soaring or plummeting. If you're carrying any debt, like on a credit card or a car loan, the cost of that debt is directly tied to the stability and demand for the US dollar. If your paycheck hasn't moved much in the last few years, but your grocery bill keeps climbing, that's a symptom of a shifting global financial landscape. For your savings, any disruption to the dollar's dominance means the value of every dollar you hold, every dollar in your 401k, could be silently eroded. This isn't just geopolitical maneuvering. It's a direct threat to the purchasing power of every dollar you earn and save. So let's set the stage here. The CEO of the biggest bank in America was recently asked a very pointed question. Will the US dollar remain the world's reserve currency? And his answer was telling. He said, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, that if America isn't the strongest military in 25 years and the strongest economy, we won't be the reserve currency either. He laid out two conditions: military strength and economic strength. But there's arguably something even more fundamental than that. It's about whether the rest of the world's money still has to flow through our economy. And that brings us to what happened this week. A couple of days ago, on August 4th, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, signed a massive 287-page law. It's called the Federal Law on Digital Currencies and Digital Rights. This law effectively means Russia just legalized crypto. It's their version of what's known as the Clarity Act. Now, the official theory, the one you'll hear in the headlines, is that Russia did this to regain access to money. Vladimir Putin said, and I quote, "Much in the same way as Russia, they might suddenly find themselves cut off from their legitimate financial assets, currently held in dollars or euros at any time. And they could also lose access to the entire Western financial payment infrastructure. We all fully understand that this is fundamentally about unfair competition. No, the excuses they provide can vary, but they will always find one like the ongoing conflict in Ukraine in our case, or a conflict in the Middle East. In another instance, the various conflicts across the African continent, or even the way they treat the LGBTQ plus community. Look, they are always going to find fault with anything. So, Putin is basically saying the US will always find a reason to put economic pressure on a nation. This law, officially, is Russia's way of clawing back its access to money. But why crypto? Well, when a company in one country sells something to a company in another, that money moves through a complex sequence of banks. Your bank to a bank that has a relationship with your bank, and so on until it reaches the seller. And in most of those chains, no matter where in the world you are, they'll end up passing through a US institution somewhere along the way. That connection point is what's called a correspondent account. It's the most important thing in international finance, because whoever controls that account controls whether your trade happens or not. Russia, as we know, lost access to a lot of those critical chains back in 2022. Now, Russia still has oil. It still has gas, precious metals, and food, and all the other things that other countries want to buy. The problem for Russia isn't having things to sell, it's getting paid for them. That's what this new law is actually about, at least on the surface. Russia wants back into the world market, and that's where crypto comes in. Crypto is what's called a bearer asset. It settles between two parties without a correspondent bank sitting in the middle, deciding whether to allow it or not. This new Russian crypto law says that if you're a Russian company importing or exporting and you want to settle a contract in crypto with a foreign country, this law says that you can do it. There's no limit on the transaction. You can even do it wallet to wallet if you want. You just have to report it and pay taxes on it. Now, hold on. Why would Russia go through all this trouble to build something legal and licensed instead of just using some shadow banks or some dark web crypto? Right? Well, here's why. Because if you try that, the US will cut you off. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just made an example of Iran and what would happen if you don't follow the rules. Scott Bessent said, and I quote, "Iran's shadow banking system is buckling under economic fury, and the regime is running out of ways to move money. Every facilitator that keeps the regime afloat is putting a target on its own back. Treasury will continue to expose these networks and cut them off from the US financial system." Okay, very interesting. What it means is the United States is actively cutting any country, company, or person out of the US dollar system if they allow sanctioned countries or businesses to go around them. That is why a couple days ago the US Treasury put out a list of a few names. There were a couple people. There were a handful of companies. And what all of them had in common was they moved money to help Iran. Hundreds of millions of dollars on the behalf of an Iranian bank in multiple currencies across at least 4 countries. And they did this using a series of shell companies. The US found out, and now it's cutting them off. So the US is basically saying, either comply with the system and play by the rules, or you don't get to play with others. If you're a sanctioned country like Russia, you want to make sure that you still have the technology to allow your country to trade with others, regardless of whether the US allows it or not. That is why Russia's passing their own version of the Clarity Act. Now, that's the official understanding of it. The unofficial theory, though, I think it's a lot more interesting, and it has much bigger implications for you. This unofficial theory says Russia is not legalizing crypto because it likes Bitcoin. What it's doing with crypto and stablecoins is it's building a wall for the tsunami of what's coming to the world. And the tsunami is when the US finally approves its own version of a Clarity Act. Why? Well, it's because of what a stablecoin actually is. Because a stablecoin is a dollar that lives on your phone. It does not need a bank or a branch in some country, right? It doesn't need permission from anyone's central bank. If you have an internet connection, you effectively have a dollar account. And that has never been true before in human history. See, for the last 80 years or so, if you were a country and you wanted to keep your citizens within the confines of your own currency, it was actually pretty easy to do because you control the banks. You control who gets a dollar account. You put in what are called capital controls, and the dollar could only get in through the doors that you control. Stablecoins, though, they sort of give the master key to anyone with access to them. Now, imagine you're Russia, right? You're sanctioned. Another country says you can't trade with others. And if you try, you can't get paid. So all your businesses get cut off. Your currency gets put under pressure. Your interest rates skyrocket because now you're forced to print money. Your citizens have watched the ruble lose value their entire lives. And now, at some point in the next year or two, the United States is going to pass a law that lets U.S. banks and U.S. corporations issue U.S. dollars onto the internet with the backing of the most stable assets in the world, U.S. treasuries, which are fully regulated. They're completely legitimate. Anyone in the world with a smartphone can hold those, including every single person in Russia. That is the tsunami. Russia's not guessing at this. They have said this themselves. Anton Kobakov, the presidential advisor to Putin and one of the people who organizes their big annual economic forum, he's warned about this. Russia is worried about basically 140 million of their own people deciding that they'd rather save in dollars on an app they have on their phone. That is something that no border could ever stop. No army that could ever defend against it. So what do, right? You can maybe try to shut off the internet. That's really hard to do. Maybe you can turn off the App Store. You can't really stop this technology. This is coming. But there is one thing you can do. And what you can do is you can get there first. You build your own digital money. You make it mandatory. You route all the people's salaries and all the businesses through it. And you make sure that by the time the dollar version comes out, right? You already have your own version. And then separately, you can use your technology to go around the sanctions because that's how you get paid. That is the unofficial theory. Russia's just building a digital wall for what's coming. So, let me explain Russia's Clarity Act and what this crypto law actually does. See, this is how we know this is not a Bitcoin adoption story, because this law does almost nothing for an ordinary Russian person who just wants to buy and invest into Bitcoin. That's because an ordinary Russian citizen is what the law calls a non-qualified investor. And so by law, they are capped at just 300,000 rubles, meaning they can buy about $3,700 worth of crypto per year. That's it. Now, before you can even buy any of it, though, Russia also wants its citizens to pass some sort of test, which they really haven't defined yet. And you can only buy assets that their regulators have pre-approved. And as of right now, that list doesn't even exist yet. They haven't published it. And even if you could get through all of that, you still can't spend any of it. The ban on using cryptocurrency to pay for goods and services inside Russia stays exactly where it was. So you can't buy a cup of coffee with it. Businesses can't even advertise that they accept Bitcoin. So for anyone saying that this is Russia being forward-thinking and adopting their Bitcoin standard for their economic model, this theory says that this is completely wrong. It was not designed for the average person saving their money to protect themselves against the evils of debasement. This law, first and foremost, is all about foreign trade. The whole point of this crypto law is to get Russia paid by other countries. Now, wait a minute. Hold on. If that's the case, then why involve and cap the citizens at all? Like a guy in Moscow buying Bitcoin is not a sanctions workaround. He's not settling an oil contract. He's got nothing to do with any of this. So why write him into the law and then test him, and then ban him from spending it? It seems odd that they would make it as hard as possible to do anything with crypto, despite it being called a crypto law. Now, the answer is because they're trying to protect against something called capital flight, meaning Russia wants to keep its money at home. It doesn't want people moving their savings out of rubles and into crypto. That's part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer, because Russia already technically has capital controls. They've had them for years. They didn't need to write 287 pages of suitability tests to stop the money from leaving their country. They already had that tool. There's something else going on here, and it has to do with what will happen on September 1st. September 1st isn't just the day this crypto law takes effect. September 1st is also the day Russia launches its own central bank digital currency, their own CBDC, or, in this case, the digital ruble. So what does this all mean for the next 6 to 12 months? I expect to see a significant acceleration in the US moving forward, with its own digital dollar initiatives, likely under the guise of financial innovation and stability. The pressure from countries like Russia, attempting to preemptively wall off their populations from the coming digital dollar, will only solidify Washington's resolve. This isn't about promoting crypto, it's about maintaining the dollar's global dominance in a new digital era, and other nations are already building their defenses. For your wallet, this means we're heading into a period of increased currency volatility as nations jockey for digital financial control. The number I'm watching closely is the pace of adoption of Russia's digital ruble, specifically its use in cross-border trade. If that number starts to climb, expect to see the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve double down on their own digital currency efforts, which will in turn ripple through everything, from bond yields to the price of basic goods. I'll see you next time.